Hey everyone, my name is Nicole Hayes, and I am currently a graduate student of Instructional Technology at the University of Wyoming. Today, I'm going to be teaching you about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. It really does sound complicated, but once we get into it, you'll truly see how simple it is. Are you ready? Let's get started. Before we really get into what this theory actually is, let's look at some of the vocabulary we find just in the title. So, some people may be confused by that word multimedia. So, what do we really mean when we say multimedia learning? When we talk about multimedia learning, we're talking about learning by using words and by using pictures. You don't use just words or just pictures. The use of both of them together in order to learn a concept is what we're talking about. So multimedia is pulling from both the audio as well as the visual. Now, the man responsible for our cognitive theory of multimedia learning is Richard Mayer. However, his theory really draws upon a lot of prior research and research of those before him. So before we really get into this cognitive theory of multimedia learning, we're going to look at the prior research, see what really helped Richard Mayer to develop this theory. One of the first researchers that we're going to look at that helped Richard Mayer to develop his cognitive theory of multimedia learning is John Sweller. Now, even though he has authored over 80 academic publications, he really is most known for the cognitive load theory, which is what we are going to look at. What is the cognitive load theory? Well, on the next slide, I will show you. Here is a quick version of Sweller's cognitive load theory. First, cognitive load is the amount of information someone is trying to process in a working memory at any one time. What is working memory, you ask? Well, your working memory is your short-term memory. It is a system for temporarily storing and managing the information required for you to carry out a complex task, such as just learning or comprehension. So when it comes to your cognitive limit, that is the maximum amount of information you can process in your working memory at any one time. Surprisingly, though, our cognitive limit is actually very limited. Therefore, you should really reduce the load as much as possible. Because overall, if your working memory is overloaded, then your learning will suffer. Now, Sweller also discusses that there are three types of cognitive loads. There is the intrinsic load, the extraneous load, and the germane load. The intrinsic load is the inherent demand of the learning task. The extraneous load is the activity or activities that are unrelated to learning, and the germane load is the attention directed to activities that promote learning. If you would like to look more into this theory, you can see where I got the information at the bottom of your screen. It really is quite interesting. Two other researchers that really helped Richard Mayer to develop our cognitive theory of multimedia learning were Alan Bedeli and Graham Hitch. Both of these researchers helped to develop the model of working memory. On the next slide, we will see how this model works. Here is our model of working memory. As I said when we were talking about the cognitive load theory, your working memory is your short-term memory and is a system for temporarily storing and managing information. However, our short-term memory is not just one single unified concept. It would be the equivalent of saying pizza is made of pizza. It doesn't make sense, right? So when we look at this working memory model, at the top we see central executive. There's not much known about this, but it is responsible for functions such as determining information and the organization of it. On the left, we have the visuospatial sketchpad, which deals with spatial and visual information. You never would have guessed that, right? On the right, we have the phonological loop, which is a system that temporarily stores auditory information. And last, in the middle, we have the episodic buffer. Less is known about this as compared to the other two, but this is where you can link information across all domains, as well as your short-term and your long-term memory. Just like last time, if you would like to read more about this model, you can read the article cited at the bottom of your screen. The last theory that we will look at before getting back to Richard Mayer is the dual coding theory. This was written by Alan Pavio, and he just recently died in June of 2016. He has published around 200 articles, but he really is most known for this dual coding theory. Let's go ahead and get started. This theory is actually quite simple. First off, though, what is dual coding? It is the design of how we process information by using visual and verbal channels at the same time. It makes sense, right? Dual meaning consists of two parts, and the two parts we use are the visual and the verbal. The verbal will store linguistic information, while our visual will store pictorial information. Both of these entities work separately. However, the relationship between the two will create a much stronger connection, therefore leading to a stronger memory. If you would like to read more about this theory, please see the citation at the bottom of the screen. Finally, we're to the entire reason that we're even here, and that is to learn about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. The person responsible for writing about this theory is Richard Mayer. He obtained his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is currently a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he is most known for this cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and I'm going to teach you all about it. Here we have our model of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Again, we're starting to see some of these elements of theories discussed prior until now. We're seeing that verbal and that visual beginning to make an appearance once again. So let's go ahead and we'll begin to walk through the model of our cognitive theory of multimedia learning step by step. Here we see the beginning of our model. At the beginning, we see two types of media, words and pictures, verbal and visual. We now see two arrows coming from the words. This is because we will either hear the words and or we will see those words. We will also see the pictures. So now that we have seen and or heard the words, as well as seen the pictures, we will select the words and select the images needed for further processing into our working memory. Remember though, we can only hold a limited cognitive load, and this is why only select verbal and visual information is stored. From there, we're going to organize those selected sounds and images into a verbal and a pictorial model. This now brings us to the last part of our model. We have created a verbal model as well as a pictorial model. Now we can integrate and connect this new material brought to us with the prior knowledge stored within our long-term memory. This brings us back to our model as a whole. I hope as I went through all the parts of this model that you could see information from all the other research that we went through prior to really getting into this cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So Richard Mayer and Ruth Clark, they wrote a book called E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, Proven Guidelines for Consumers and Designers of Multimedia Learning. And this book is where I pulled the model for our cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Well, in this book, they also discuss 7 principles for multimedia learning that are quite interesting because as a teacher, I always am trying to bring multimedia into my classroom, and these principles really help you learn how to do it the right way. So I'm just going to very briefly go over all 7 of them, and then if you ever want to look at them more in depth, I did put the citation for the book at the bottom of the screen if you ever wanted to check it out. Okay, let's get started. The first principle that I'm going to talk about will be the multimedia principle. This principle simply states that words and pictures used together are vastly more effective than just pictures used alone or than words just used alone. You use both of them together to ensure the most effective learning. The second principle that I'm going to talk about is the contiguity principle. With this principle, you want to align words to corresponding graphics. On the left, we have a really bad example of what you want to do. In that example, this principle is violated because those labels of the brain are physically separated from the images on the brain. So you're really having to go back and forth, and you can't really easily tell which letter or which words go with which part of the brain. And this information is much harder to store into your brain because of that back and forth you're going to have to do. However, on the right side, we have a really good example of this principle. Our words are very closely related to our picture. This contiguity principle is followed really well in this example because those labels for the brain are placed very physically close to the picture of the brain itself. So in this case, you would really want to do what's on the right more than what you would want to do on the left. The third principle that I'm going to talk about is the modality principle. With this principle, you want to present words as speech rather than on-screen text. According to Clark and Mayer, your learners are going to learn much better when your new information is presented with narration rather than on-screen text, especially if whatever you are presenting is very complex and if it comes with a very complex graphic. The next principle I'm going to talk about is the redundancy principle. With this principle, you want to make sure that you're explaining visuals with words and audio or text. Do not use both at the same time. If you're using both audio and text at the same time, you're really going to overload your learner. They may not be as focused on the graphic as you like because instead of listening to the audio of what you're saying, they may be trying to read the captions that you have. Therefore, they're really not looking at that visual that you really might want them focused on. So if you're going to use words, make sure that you're using them either in audio or in text, one or the other. Do not use both at the same time. In other words, don't be redundant. The next principle that I'm going to talk about is the coherence principle. Clark and Mayer said that this might be the most important recommendation they have, and that is because the coherence principle is often violated. Now, the coherence principle, you need to remember that adding material can hurt learning. It goes back to that saying of quantity does not equal quality. You want to make sure you keep your lessons uncluttered. Because if they look very cluttered, like both of these examples I have here, your learner is not going to know which information is the most important to focus on. If they don't know which information to focus on, they're really not going to learn the material that you actually want them to learn. So, keep them simple and don't clutter your lessons. Now we have the personalization principle, and this one is just like it sounds. We've all had that teacher, right? Like the one of Charlie Brown, or the one I have pictured here on the screen. In Clark and Mayer, they talk about how you want to use a conversational style and virtual coaches. You want to make sure that you have a friendly human voice. People don't learn from those who sound like a robot or things like that. If you're conversational, you add your own personal touches to it, and you're just friendly in nature, people are more apt to actually learn from you as opposed to that monotone robot sounding person. The last principle we have is the segmenting and pre-training principle. With this principle, you want to make sure that if you have some really complex material, they kind of chunk it out into smaller parts. You don't want to give them all the information at once. If you kind of chunk it into smaller portions and do it step by step and little by little, maybe like a little bit each day, your learners, it's going to be really more effective. And then pre-training, if you know you're going to have a complex material or complex lesson really coming up, maybe see if you can instill some background knowledge. For example, maybe if you're going to do some things with a microscope, maybe the week before, teach them all the parts of a microscope and what everything is. That way, when you actually have to jump into the lesson, you're not having to teach all that to them. That will be some background knowledge that your learners already have. So make sure you break things into smaller parts, and then make sure that your learners also know some key concepts or ideas before really starting a complex lesson. We have come to the end of my presentation on the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Throughout this journey, we have also learned about the cognitive load theory by John Sweller, the model of working memory by Alan Badelli and Graham Hitch, and the dual coding theory by Alan Pavio. We have learned that in order to foster effective learning, you need to utilize both the verbal and the visual. We have gone through the model of our cognitive theory of multimedia learning, as well as 7 multimedia learning principles that were developed based on this theory. I hope you enjoyed. See you again next time.